Hello again, UTF. In part 1 I explained why the way in which you represented the anarchist position was full of inaccuracies and a total strawman that was completely detached from reality. In this part I'd like to explain why your arguments against this strawman of the anarchist position fail when applied to what anarchists actually believe. You made about 5 arguments which were as follows. If you don't like experiencing the legal sanctions that occur if you engage in certain activities, then you should not engage in said activities. Anarchy doesn't exist. Anarchism wouldn't be any less corrupt than our current society. Opening up prisons would create chaos. Anarchists are doing and saying nothing to change anything. I will address each of these in turn. Firstly, as I mentioned in part 1, for whatever reason you decided to base a significant amount of your video on a meme that you saw on Facebook. This meme was really silly and not at all representative of anarchism, and it included complaining about the fact that there are legal sanctions for speeding. And you responded by saying this.
I have an idea. If you want to avoid all that stuff, the chases, the tasings, the bullets flying over your head and going through your windshield and then sometimes embedding themselves in your body, you could pull over!
So the underlying premise is, if you don't like dealing with the police force, then you should just obey the law. But the main reason why anarchists don't like the police is because their primary function is to repress the working class, in part through the criminalisation of certain tools for engaging in social struggles, and making sure that people aren't too militant in their demands or their actions. Now, individual police officers are not necessarily going to be aware that this is the function of the police force, but that's basically what their institutional role is. Lisa knows the score.
Mom, I know your intentions are good, but aren't the police a protective force that maintains the status quo for the wealthy elites? Don't you think we ought to attack the roots of social problems instead of jamming people into overcrowded prisons?
Look, Lisa, it's McGriff, the crime dog. Hello, Lisa. Help me bite crime. Ruff, ruff.
Now, if we apply this reasoning of, if you don't like dealing with the police force, then you should just obey the law, as a counter-argument to the anarchist position, then what follows is pretty simple. If you don't like the fact that the police criminalise certain tools for engaging in social struggles, then just don't use these tools. Logically, that follows from what you're saying, and this would of course have the effect of declawing social movements in the classic liberal fashion and rendering them ineffective to deliver the necessary change, which for many people is a necessity for their quality of life. So this idea of, well, if you don't like the police force, then just obey the law, leads to deeply counterintuitive conclusions when you actually apply it to the fact that anarchists criticise the police force because their primary function is to repress the working class. Next argument.
It's not because I want anarchy, because anarchy doesn't exist.
Now this is a hugely problematic claim, primarily because, as I said in part 1, anarchists tend to view anarchism as a continuous process rather than a fixed idea, a process in which you identify hierarchies, challenge their legitimacy, and dismantle them from below and replace them with horizontal organisation if they fail to meet their burden of proof. So there's really no point at which anarchists will sit down and say, "Hooray! Anarchism has been achieved, we're done now." So it's basically a continuous process. So technically, it's probably better to talk in terms of more anarchy or less anarchy rather than anarchy or no anarchy. But I digress. Now, an anarchist economy would be based on workers' control over the means of production through participatory democracy. This means that what to produce, how to produce it, where to produce it, and what to do with the surplus are all decided by the workers themselves in a democratic system rather than a hierarchical system run in the interests of a boss. Does this exist, or has it existed? Yes. For examples, you can read Ours to Master and to Own, a compilation of essays on the history of democratic enterprises in Europe, Latin America, North America and Africa. You can also read Horizontalism, Voices of Popular Power in Argentina, which compiles testimonies of neighbourhood assemblies, workplace occupations, and the establishment of self-managing enterprises like Fábrica San Patrones, which in Spanish means factory without bosses, which was taken under worker control after a long and bitter struggle against the previous owners, as is usually the case, and involved camping outside of the factory for months without receiving any wages. If you want to claim that anarchism doesn't exist, you should firstly understand what it is. Secondly, you should recognise the fact that there are, in fact, spaces where anarchist forms of organisation are used. And thirdly, you should acknowledge that These spaces are almost never established without a struggle, because this is a very hierarchical society, and the hierarchical structures that do exist are not necessarily legitimate. So the fact that non-hierarchical organisation is rare does not necessarily discredit the anarchist position. Your claim that anarchy doesn't exist doesn't imply anything about whether it should exist. While slavery continued for thousands of years, its abolition was considered unfeasible and idealistic, and it was just a common belief that some people were naturally slaves. And criticising the capitalist oligarchy that we have today is likely to elicit exactly the same response about how some people are just natural leaders and some people naturally follow orders. We've been wrong about many things before, and I don't think it's at all unreasonable to suggest that we might be wrong in thinking that this neo-feudalist, capitalist, plutocratic, oligarchical, imperialist, sexist, racist, ecocidal death machine is the best system that we could ever have. Next argument.
What makes you fucking think that your society wouldn't be corrupt? Your society would be filled with human beings. You give human beings power, eventually one of them will take advantage of it, take advantage of others, pervert that power, use that power for their own interests. Your society would be no exception at all. Your society wouldn't be so spotless either, wouldn't be so clean either.
Human beings are capable of a wide range of behaviours, and usually the way they behave varies according to certain circumstances. Yes, people can and do abuse power. However, this does depend on certain factors, such as how the power is distributed. If it's highly concentrated in the hands of an individual, then this person will likely become highly corrupt. However, if it's equally distributed among a group, then people will be far more humane to one another. If people are good enough to manage their own affairs, but not good enough to run the affairs of other people, then that's an argument against putting people into hierarchical settings, not an argument for it. If the premises hold, which I think they do, then it surely follows that the antidote to corruption is to have a society which is as non-hierarchical as possible. And this is exactly what anarchists want to do.
The people you put in place to govern your little society, the people you put in place to police your little society.
But you still assume that we want to put people in charge to govern the society and police it from above, which we clearly don't, which again highlights your total lack of understanding. If you look at equalitytrust.org.uk, you can see how social stratification affects health, trust, participation, attitudes, happiness, crime, social mobility, education and economic stability. The evidence shows that inequality makes pretty much everything worse. Now the spectrum examined is predominantly from neoliberalism, what we have here, to Keynesianism, what you'll find in many European countries which liberals like to pretend is socialism for some reason. But if you have workers' control, then the class relations that form the basis of the capitalist system are gone. So, despite the fact that social stratification observably exacerbates health and social problems, and despite the fact that anarchism is clearly radically more egalitarian, you're claiming that it would be just as bad. And logically, that just doesn't follow. Our society treats antisocial behaviour as though it's just bad people being bad. If you did something wrong, that must be because you're bad, and you should be punished for being bad. But this divorces crime from the society in which it occurs. To quote Voltaire de Cleyre, "The hells of capitalism create the desperate, and the desperate act desperately." The alternative approach to crime adopted by anarchists is to eliminate the social conditions that cause it to occur in the first place, as well as having diffuse and organised sanctions, as I mentioned in part 1, which may be violent or non-violent, to deal with remaining antisocial behaviour. The economist Richard D. Wolff has a website, book and YouTube channel called Democracy at Work. And on the website and the YouTube channel, you can find out precisely how worker self-management would reduce inequality, protect the environment, transform education, and democratise the society as a whole. A study recently came out in April demonstrating that the US is basically an oligarchy, and that the overwhelming thrust of policy is determined in the interests of economic elites. But do you really think that if we took institutions under popular control and ran them for the benefit of everybody and not just a few people, that we would still pay some people millions while leaving others homeless? Do you still think that a few people would be destroying the environment at the expense of everybody else? Of course not. Now this is how it works in theory as well as in practice. So the old, oh, it's good on paper but it doesn't work in practice is just a standard liberal cop-out. You can look at studies of anarchism and worker self-management in revolutionary Spain, such as those by Frank Mintz, Sam Dolgoff and Gaston Laval. Frank Mintz's study concluded that in total, around 1,838,000 people were involved in the collectivization of industry and agriculture during the Spanish Revolution, according to figures from the CNT. But yeah, anarchists are doing nothing to change anything, right? In Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell wrote about his experiences in revolutionary Spain, and he stated that, quote, many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted era of England. There was no one but the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. There was no unemployment, and the price of living was still extremely low. You saw very few conspicuously destitute people, and no beggars except the gypsies. Above all, there was a belief in the revolution and the future, a feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom. Human beings were trying to behave as human beings, and not as cogs in the capitalist machine. And I think we can all agree that that sounds awful. A feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom? No conspicuously destitute people? Lame. I think that this neo-feudalist, capitalist, plutocratic, oligarchical, imperialist, sexist, racist, ecocidal death machine is so much better. But this anarchism stuff, well, you know, it's good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. And that is a true fact that you should believe, and it's totally not a made-up propaganda slogan spread about by the right wing in order to pacify the population and protect existing institutional structures. It's not about that at all. Sarcasm aside, your claim that anarchism would be just as corrupt as our existing society just doesn't stack up to the facts. Social hierarchies have an observable tendency to increase corruption and exacerbate health and social problems. Anarchism seeks to dismantle said social hierarchies, and this observably reduces corruption and social problems when implemented on a practical level. Your claim requires that we ignore some or all of these facts. So when you ask, what makes you think that anarchism wouldn't be corrupt? I answer, reason and evidence.
Oh, there go the doors to all the jails. They're just open now. And out come, as George Carlin said, out come our old friends, the ones who've been away for a while, at camp. And while some of them will be grateful for this opportunity, for freedom, and will probably reform, most of them will see that there are no cops around to put them back in the place where they belonged in the first place, and they will create chaos.
If prisoners re-offend after being released, perhaps that shows you how effective the prison system is in rehabilitating people. This happens all of the time in our society, and so it's very easy to assume that opening up prisons would have exactly the same effect. However, this disregards the fact that anarchists seek to work with and interact with incarcerated people such that they don't re-offend upon being released. And, contrary to what you might think, the claim that freed prisoners would cause chaos is false. Up to and during the Spanish Revolution, anarchists would spread political consciousness among the prisoners, and when the jails were opened up in Valencia, for example, most of them did not go around spreading chaos for the sake of it, but instead they joined the Iron Column and fought to defend the popular revolution against the fascists. And even if there were some people who re-offended upon release, the social conditions of an egalitarian society would reduce the likelihood of this happening, and there would be sanctions in place, as I outlined in part 1. So even if this were a significant problem, it would still be minuscule in comparison to what's happening right now, like living under constant threat of nuclear war and the systematic destruction of the environment. So even if this were true, it still wouldn't be nearly enough to suggest abandoning the anarchist project altogether, and it's still a very weak argument.
You have this utopian idea, and it's all nice and good, you know, it's good on paper, but it's not going to work. You're doing nothing to change anything. You're saying nothing to change anything.
This is the part where your extreme ignorance of anarchism, both as a political philosophy and a historical movement, just slips into the downright offensive. A long and bitter struggle has taken place to establish workers' control over production over the course of hundreds of years. And to highlight this point most appropriately, here's just a small fraction of the anarchists that you should apologise to for completely ignoring their efforts to make a better society. Firstly, the Haymarket Marches, 8 anarchists who were hanged after a police set-up during their struggle in the participation of largely immigrant workers for the 8-hour day. That's a right which you enjoy today, providing the inspiration for International Workers' Day, or May Day, which is a global celebration of the labour movement for socialists, communists and anarchists around the world.
Yesterday was May Day, where communists and socialists celebrate their belief that stealing private property is a good thing.
Thanks, Bill. Noam Chomsky, who is a philosopher, linguist and activist. Chomsky's most extensive work gives informative and detailed analyses on the purposes of US foreign policy as well as the societal functions of the mass media. He goes around giving talks, partly to help bring people together that are working on the same issues and to help get them organised. Chomsky's been arrested on numerous occasions for his anti-war activism, as well as being tracked by the CIA. Emma Goldman, who was an anarchist, a feminist, and one of the first people to speak out against the prosecution of people for being gay in the 1920s, being streets ahead of liberals and even anarchists on this matter, despite the parasitic attempts of liberals to co-opt the achievements of the radical left. The Zapatista communities of rural indigenous people in Chiapas, Mexico, which have been autonomous for about 20 years, continuously defending themselves against military, paramilitary and corporate incursions into Chiapas, and the numerous anarchists around the world that have been setting up networks of solidarity and mutual support for these people. The Anarchists and the Industrial Workers of the World, which is an international organisation seeking democratic control of the means of production. The IWW, although not explicitly anarchist, has been an organising force for over 100 years, and was the first union in the US to use the sit-down strike as a method of struggle. While mainstream labour unions organise to increase the wages of prison guards, the IWW, on the other hand, organises incarcerated workers to take action against slave labour in American prisons. The IWW also supports the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign against the vicious atrocities committed by the Israeli state against the Palestinians. Ilan Shalif, an Israeli anarchist who marches to the separation wall every single week to protest the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the bombing of schools and hospitals, facing tear gas and rubber bullets from the police force. Just so you know, he'll be 77 this month. The anarchists in the CNT and the FAI who struggled for several decades up to and including the Spanish Revolution, the anarchists who fought and died in the militias fighting fascism, and the anarchists in the CNT today who continue to fight for change and re-establish the collective ownership of enterprises. The anarchists who have set up the Autonomous Centre of Edinburgh, which is a social centre that provides a space for non-hierarchical groups of people just like you to organise, resist and take back control of their own lives after being systematically attacked for over 30 years with devastating cuts, privatisation and the neoliberal financialisation of the economy spearheaded by Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US. And the thousands upon thousands of anarchists around the world, people whose names you'll never hear on television, continuing to struggle day on day on day for a freer, fairer and more just society in the face of massive institutional pressures from the mass media and the education system that just mindlessly accept the status quo and accept whatever your leaders are up to. These are all of the people that you owe an apology to. You know, we live in a society that says that you're just some atomized individual whose sole purpose is to maximize fashionable consumption, and that one half of the time you spend awake should be spent doing boring, repetitive tasks under the supervision of some authority figure who takes the lion's share of what you produce, and the other half should be spent watching sports and eating junk food, never caring about what other people are up to. And meanwhile, as you're watching television, the caretakers of the system who do know what's best for you and who you should trust to run your life get to make lots and lots of money by killing innocent civilians and mercilessly exploiting natural resources, slowly but surely driving the species to extinction. But oh no, these bloody anarchists, how dare they try to tamper with arrangements? Why don't they just go outside and piss on the cheese, shit in an alleyway and punch people randomly? Don't they realise that anarchism would just be chaos? Why don't they realise that their ideas just aren't good enough? Eh? Why don't they just shut up? Why don't they just pack their bags and leave? How dare they try to organise people and fight back? I sincerely hope that if you ever plan on making another video on this topic again, and you don't even have to agree with us, but if you want to improve your arguments, if you care about the truth, and you don't want to spread misinformation and falsehoods, then at the very least, you should take the time to understand a fucking thing you're talking about. And by the way, I don't doubt for a second that you're more than capable of understanding these concepts. In fact, a lot of the analysis of the political and economic system is very much up your street. You quoted George Carlin in your video. You know how George Carlin talks about how the education system is basically designed to train people to be obedient workers? Well, we have an analysis of why this is the case. You know how he also talks about how the primary function of politicians is to distract the public into thinking that they have freedom of choice, when in fact the public just have owners, people who own them, who control all of the property? We have an analysis of why this is the case. And also, most importantly, we have ways of fighting back and creating alternatives. And we're not under any fucking illusions that voting Democrat or Republican or any of that is somehow going to change our society in any significant way. Now, if you want, we can talk about it, or you can check out The Left Libertarian, who has some fantastic introductory videos criticising corruption in politics, front groups and so on. Now, it's up to you whether you want to keep this frankly embarrassing and ill-informed video up. But seriously, I think you need to look at the evidence and reevaluate your perspective. For more anarchist content, subscribe to Libertarian Socialist Rants, Anarcho-Pack and Anarchist Collective. Thanks for watching.